The Antichrist is essentially Greta Thunberg.
It would be racist if we don't allow the robots to exist.
It's all going to be great. We're going to cure cancer.
They see themselves as these kind of mythical gods.
I mean, at no point in history has there been a situation like this where such a small group of people has amassed such incredible wealth and power.
Hey Ben, welcome back to The Plan. Here we are again. We did some, just want to get right down to a deep rabbit hole, right? Because we talked previously on episodes about the assault on reality, where things were kind of going, the tech barons, how they're having an influence on the world. We talked about nation states, all these kind of things. And we kind of touched upon where some of these guys see where we're going next as human species, basically. And one of the things that's been coined quite a lot is this word transhumanism, which feels like a relatively new idea, but I know that it's been around for a few decades and it's kind of evolved now into something else. So I just wanted to try and get your thoughts on that, and then maybe we should first start by sort of describing what transhumanism actually is.
Yeah. Well, morning, Simon. Let's go straight into it. So the idea is essentially that we can fundamentally alter what it is to be human. I think for many of the thinkers that promote transhumanism. So it's about human transformation, but it's very much the idea that we can transcend humanity altogether and become something else, possibly through some kind of fusion with artificial intelligence, with computers, and so on. But as you say, the idea's been around for a while. So it'd be worth looking a little bit, where it comes from as well.
Yeah, so I think probably in the modern day, well, that's kind of like today's day, it seems to be more related to this idea of integration of technology into the human level, either from a biological aspect, or things like Neuralink, or through prosthetics, or as you say, this kind of transcendence of where they think that the human race is going to try and evolve, and this idea of kind of immortality as well, and trying to sort of push those boundaries. And what their reasoning is behind that, whether they want to become almost like these kind of mythical godlike creatures and leave their legacy in that way. But there are some sort of kind of fundamental underlying fears which we'll get into kind of later. But the first instance when I saw that sort of transhumanism was first coined was probably about 1957, something like that. I think, as we were sort of discussing before off camera, it's come a bit more into fruition sort of like in the late 80s, where it's become this new sort of philosophical evolution of kind of where we are now. And it seems to be involving some of the key players that we keep talking about in the plan, who are looking at the seasteadings, the nation states. It's got the same players. And some of those that come to mind are people like Peter Thiel, who, we've seen these instances where he's talked about transgenderism, and he's talked about transvestites, and saying, it's not enough. We need to push it further. We need to go beyond that. The human race needs to go beyond that. And what is the sort of real kind of drive behind that with these people? Because it seems almost nihilistic in terms of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very old idea going back to religious for thousands of years, but it's been given a real boost, I think, by the supposed advances in artificial intelligence that we've seen recently, and other technological advances. You mentioned Neuralink, so some other areas like that. So I think that's given it a boost. The modern idea transhumanism has been around since the 60s, 70s. It's very much a California idea, like many of these ideas, and is really kind of gestates amongst a bunch of people who are kind of around the University of California in the 1960s. But I think it's in a way taken on a slightly darker turn, like many of these things over the last few years, and this idea of really kind of leaving humanity behind on one level, at least humanity as we know it, but also I think in many cases, in order to kind of boost the kind of hype around the technologies that these people are selling, they have to also redefine what being human is, and often not in a good way, often in a way that kind of, in my view, devalues what being human is about. But I mean, maybe just to dig into the kind of history a little bit. So, the idea of transcending humanity is a religious idea. It's been around forever, right? For thousands of years. But in its modern terms, in its modern meaning, I think we can trace it back to this guy called Feridun M. Esfandiari, who's a really interesting character, who changes his name to FM 2030.
Of course he does, why not?
So he changes his name to FM 2030, and the reason he does this is because he was born in 1930, and he essentially thinks that he can still be alive in 2030 and reach 100 years. And he's this Belgian-born Iranian-American guy, philosopher, and Olympic athlete as well, who ends up teaching at the New School in the 1960s around kind of new concepts of the human. And he's very into this idea of kind of having artificial body parts, being able to expand lifespans. Yes, he does have his body frozen when he dies, sadly, of pancreatic cancer in 2000. So he doesn't get to be FM 2030. He gets to be FM 2000. And does have his body frozen. And it's quite important that a lot of these thinkers in the 60s, when the whole transhumanism takes on its modern meaning, they're also really linked to this thing called cryogenics, which is essentially freezing your body, right? And sometimes your whole body, sometimes just your head. And they're involved in this Alcor Foundation, which is this kind of non-profit that's set up that is literally starts to freeze people's bodies. You have to pay for it, but they start to freeze people's bodies. I think there's probably about 250 people who've done it, the whole procedure since then. And then you get this guy called Max Moore, is a UK philosopher, again, ends up teaching in California, and he develops the principles of transhumanism as this kind of futurist philosophy. And he coins this term extropy, and the philosophy of extropianism, which is an evolving framework of values and standards for continuously improving the human condition. And essentially the aim of the extropians is to advance science and technology so that we can let people eventually live indefinitely. So we basically transcend mortality. And he develops this set of principles, the principles of extropy. He forms the Extropy Institute and a bunch of other institutions around California at that time. And he becomes the CEO of the Alcor Foundation, which is the same body which is freezing people's bodies.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So there's a little bit how this thing comes together in its kind of modern sense.
Yeah, it's quite crazy. I mean, one of the things that when I was doing research into this, it kind of really struck me, which was quite interesting. It's almost like an oxymoron in terms of is how involved theology is with all of this and the spirituality of it as well. Whether you're talking through aspects of Christianity or Greek mythology or these kind of things, but also this kind of essence of how we've talked before in past planned podcast episodes about how this science fiction and this science fact is coming to pass, and we keep referring to things like The Matrix, which is kind of tapping into the head as well, and that's got its own kind of religious references in it as well, and this kind of savior, this kind of hero's journey type thing, and it's almost like they're kind of continually trying to retell this story, but this theological idea of being able to create, almost these kind of gods, and the idea of that, with AI, and we talk about sort of like things like consciousness and stuff like that, when we don't really know what consciousness is. But if we're sort of plugging ourselves in and we're getting this greater sort of cultural divide or this kind of limitless thing of being able to sort of like download to the point where our brains are so saturated, where is humanity in that? Where is yourself? Where is your so-called soul? So, you know, and that there's these ideas of like, I think some of these theologies say that, you know, we've got this kind of marker of 120 years as humans, that's the maximum we can live, and then everything just kind of falls apart. And we've seen, I can't remember the guy's name at the moment, we'll put it down in the thing below, but there's that multi-millionaire or that billionaire guy who's now trying to, you know, he's testing his body to try and live longer and longer, but he's mainly doing that through kind of supplements and not going outside, and, you know, blood plasma transfusions and stuff. But I think one of the key areas we talk about sort of transhumanism being around from sort of like the being coined in the late 50s and to where we are now is there are different aspects or different theories about transhumanism, and we have that from the idea of things like Neuralinks or brain gates through to genetic engineering to prosthetics to all these kind of things, but they're now sort of kind of coalescing into one because we have those technologies. And I think, as you was mentioning before, the whole cryogenics thing is very much a kind of baby boomers idea of what transhumanism is. Whereas, you know, we see things like even on like Amazon now, they've got this kind of ridiculous show called Upload, where you kind of upload your thoughts and you have this kind of afterlife there, and that's how you have the, you know, this immortality. And Elon's talks before about, you know, telepathy and stuff like that, you know, just that's how we're going to communicate. And maybe, you know, the other worrying sort of thing is that we'll get to a stage where we'll be able to conduct like a hive mentality, which is something I want to sort of talk about in another episode to do with some other bits and pieces as well. But things like with like kind of Peter Thiel is quite an interesting one. I just want to kind of look at him for a kind of second, because his views seem quite skewed in terms of like, you know, this transhumanism and sort of like where he kind of fits in society. And, you know, we've seen some sort of short reels before in himself and sort of kind of paraphrasing where he's talked about sort of transgenderism and transvestites and saying it's not enough and he needs to go forward more, and then he's sort of been seen quoting Bible verses and all these kind of things. And I sometimes wonder what if there's some sort of kind of political thing behind that, or what the push is on something like that. And whether you've got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, you know, as we said, it's a very ancient religious idea. According to Nick Bostrom, the academic we've talked about in various episodes, you know, one of the founders of effective altruism, he says that the idea goes back to the kind of quest for immortality that you see in kind of ancient texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the kind of search for the fountain of youth, the elixir of life, all those kind of things. In fact, in the Divine Comedy, Dante uses the word transhumana, which means to transcend human nature, to pass beyond human nature. Although I guess one of the interesting things in the Christian tradition is that there's a soul, right, that links your current self to when you transcend through religion and through your relation with God, right? But there's a soul that maintains your identity. And I think one of the worrying things about a lot of the transhumanists is that they don't really care too much about that identity of the self. They don't really care if it's you. It could be something else. It could be the AI or some future superior kind of, you know, species that takes over instead of us, right? And this idea of the upload, you know, in some way becomes one of the dominant strains of transhumanism. So it goes, you know, the technology, what they're into technologically depends on kind of how things develop in terms of Silicon Valley capitalism, and also technological breakthroughs, like you said. So I mean, it was really about cryogenics for a long time. There was a period when it was about nanotechnology for a lot of those people, and now it's mainly about the AI, but also around things like Neuralink as well. And like you said, this convergence of technology around AI, different types of technologies talking to each other. So the kind of technological focus kind of comes and goes, different focus depending on what's going on in the real world to some extent, or at least where Silicon Valley sees the real world. But the basic impulse is a kind of religious one, right? In a way.
I mean, I've seen, and this is where it always gets confusing for me, because I've seen people sort of reporting or pushing this idea of their theologies behind it or their spiritualities behind it as to why they're kind of doing this stuff. But at the same time, there's also been a sort of kind of semi-nihilistic approach in terms of the way they present things. Like I've seen some people within that sphere quoting Nietzsche and sort of talking about things, you know, to paraphrase that, you know, the way he saw mankind or humankind was as a bridge, not the end. So they say, they're like, well, mankind's not important. We don't serve a purpose other than to evolve. So surely this transhumanism is the next kind of push forward. So there's this kind of idea that this whole kind of greater good kind of thing. So it's you end up with this kind of dystopian character basically, with this constant upload and saturate, because this kind of speed and pace for technology, and we've seen it with films like, it's not quite the same. You could say it's got a level of transhumanism to it, but the old film from, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 years ago, Limitless, where he takes a pill and suddenly he can just absorb all this information, and his level of intellect, he writes a book within like half an hour, all these kind of stuff. But the gap that then is created between him and his original self is unfathomable. And with the ideas of what they're trying to do in terms of plugging in or genetic modification or all these kind of things, is going to create such a gap between sort of where the average human is now to that surely that's going to create other social problems, revolts, things like that. And it's kind of crazy that they're sort of, they speak openly about some of these things, and they're just like, well, that's just the course. And a lot of these people as well, I know Sam Altman and people like that publicly said, it's inevitable that we're going to be replaced, whether that's by, they don't believe it's going to be like Terminator machines, but it's going to be like a version of ourselves. And some would argue that obviously the transhumanism has started in other ways as well. We've got our phones in our pockets, where that's kind of the extension of our IQ now. You're no longer going down the pub and sort of trying to double down on information you may not really kind of know about, which is what the chat GPTs are doing of the world. But we're kind of feeding this information. It's like, the whole thing, the other thing about, I think, with the transhumanism is very elitist as well. It doesn't take into account all the other people below.
But the thing is, on a basic level, it's about ego. So it's like, how do you preserve yourself?
Yeah, 100%.
Right. So how do you live longer, right? Because you don't want to let go of yourself, or at least yourself as expressed in the ego, right? And there's different ways of kind of transcending that and maintaining self. Right. One is through having this essential soul, and it's interesting in the Matrix. Even in the Matrix, if he gets killed in the Matrix, his kind of human body, which is up on his ship, he kind of dies. And if his human body gets killed, his self in the Matrix also kind of dies. So even there's some kind of link between the kind of physical self, organic self, and his kind of digital self that lives in this digital dystopia, right, which the machines control. So it's interesting, and I think that reflects the fact that they have a deep problem of kind of, if we upload ourselves, how do we maintain the self? Because our self and is so linked to our physical and organic development, right, of the brain and of our muscle memory and of everything we've lived through. And I think that's a real challenge for them, that they would like to overcome in some way by kind of, like I said, essentially devaluing what makes up a human and trying to reduce the human actually to kind of activities which are computer-like. So the human becomes a kind of a code processing or a language processing machine in some way, or a signal. They do it in different ways, but it's always about trying to, in a way, reduce humanity to kind of saying, well, we're kind of like computers. We process images and we process language, and we do those kind of computer-like things. So why can't we somehow maintain that by uploading it somehow? But they can't do that, right?
No, I mean, I think obviously to a degree as humans we are kind of programmed, nature versus nurture, but it's those little nuances within us that kind of dictate how we are. But I think there was something really important that you kind of you touched upon there, which is the ego aspect. Now, the common human trait, like any other animal, is survival. Keep the species kind of going. And the fact that you mentioned that it's almost to keep the ego going rather than humanity as such is quite interesting. Like you say, it's down to the individual, and if you just got like 4 tech barons and their friends, say 30 people with all these kind of transhuman things where, they finally tested it on the masses, killed off a few people because it hasn't worked, and now they found the elixir and they can live for as long as they want and they can be these gods and all this kind of stuff. Where are humans in that equation? Where is humanity in that equation? There was this idea of like, I think it was mentioned by, the godfather of AI, I can't remember his name right now, British guy. Basically, he's out there now trying to sort of talk to people about the worries of AI and stuff like that. But he was talking about in terms of like replacing a single brain cell, you can get it to mimic the original brain cell, and the rest of the brain wouldn't know. And then he said, well, you can keep doing that to the point where the brain doesn't really see anything's going on until the whole thing is actually replaced. But by then you're no longer human, you're a replica, so to speak, you know. And then they have these ideas of, you know, taking the best bits of humanity, or the best bits of human. But these are often people with quite skewed views to begin with, and all these things have kind of been trained with their kind of thought patterns or their own personal truths or their own egos in that kind of regard.
Yeah, the thing is, it's, you know, like most things, it's a spectrum of what's possible, what they think is possible, what's actually possible. And I mean, on the more kind of innocent side of it, it's just people trying to extend their longevity, right? And the longevity industry is a huge thing in California, but in the whole world now as well, right? You know, supplements and supplements, you know, most sites on the internet, you know, that are kind of to do with this stuff, but also to do with conspiracy theories and things like that. Their main advertisers are supplements. Yeah, it's a huge industry. I mean, we'd have to look into it in a different episode of just how much capital and how much money is moved by the supplements industry. But it seems to be huge if you look online. So, for instance, I mean, Natasha Vita-More, who's a futurist, philosopher of the transhumanist movement. She's the kind of organizer of the kind of official transhumanist
This is the
movement.
wife of the Max More guy.
She's also married to Max More, but she's a philosopher, also a conceptual artist. She's 75 right now, and she's ripped. I mean, she's jacked.
Okay.
Right? You want to go and look at her YouTube videos. I mean, she's out there. She's jacked at 75.
Wow.
And she's got this kind of incredible lifestyle. She's out there doing weights. She's doing all this stuff. Kind of her whole focus is on longevity and preserving herself. Now, on one level, there's nothing wrong with that, you know. And I'm quite in awe of her. In fact, watching her, you know, being jacked at 75, and you know, there's nothing wrong with that. Although there is a kind of, I think, a desperation amongst many of the Silicon Valley types who are just pumping themselves full of cures and supplements all the time, and some of them taking like 150 different supplements. They're you know, you get these kind of young couples now out on social media who go to bed at 9 o'clock at night, and they test each other biologically before they hook up, so that they're only with other people who are going to live as long as they think they're going to live. And they're not having any fun. You know, they're literally going to bed at 9 and not doing very much because they're just worried about living into their kind of hundreds and 150s, right? So I do feel a kind of desperation about it. It's also a wealth thing. I mean, it's very much a kind of California wealth thing. Like, I'm so wealthy. I mean, surely I can beat death, right? You know, I can't die. I'm so wealthy and powerful. I can't die, can I? And you know, I'll literally go out and pay somebody hundreds of thousands of dollars to freeze my body. I'll pay all these, all these doctors for these dubious medical techniques, right? I mean, it's a way of parting people from their money, and it's a way of desperate people wanting to stay alive and stay young in a world where that's not really what we are, right? In my view. So there's that aspect of it, and then there's this kind of moment where you get people like Ray Kurzweil, who, you know, studied with Marvin Minsky at MIT. He's into language recognition, speech recognition, innovates with software, becomes a very important figure in Silicon Valley. And he has got this idea of the singularity, where essentially all these technological trends will come together to allow transcendence. I think he thinks by 2045. And he thinks that there's this kind of acceleration of technology that will then kind of allow this kind of moment of kind of singularity where it all comes together and we kind of transcend. I mean, the guy, from what I know about him, he's taking thousands of supplements. He's intensely concerned about his own longevity, right? And that's something to think about in itself, right? Is that really what we should be doing?
It's quite funny. It reminds me, I think it was, I'm probably wrong on this, I'll coin it anyway, but it's, I think it was something that Ricky Gervais said ages ago, and they were telling him basically that, you know, if you stop smoking and you stop drinking, you'll live another 10 years. And he was just like, well, the last 10 years of life are the shittest, right? Just because, you know, your body withers, you can't really do anything. But that brings back another important aspect as well. It's like, if we live, we do everything we do as humans because we value life because it's finite, right? in the eyes of the world that we see at the moment. Average age going up to, I suppose, 82 for men in this country, something like that. If suddenly that becomes 200, then the perspectives change. Also, in terms of the way people see religion within society, massively changes as well. It puts a slant on that. But yeah, it's, again, like I was saying to you, this billionaire guy who made his money through pharmaceuticals, trying to live longer as well. He doesn't have a life. He doesn't go outside. He's constantly popping pills, needs to be in bed by, like you say, 9 o'clock. He has to have his meal at a certain time. It's a full plant-based diet, but it's like the strangest plant-based diet, all these kind of things. And he himself he says that he's not going to live to a certain amount of time, maybe 100 he's hoping. But he wants to be that kind of, the example that in 300 years from now, people say, okay, look, this was the first guy that did it. He broke these boundaries, so we know they can do this. So obviously there's money behind closed doors, which is sort of being pushed through. And I think that's where kind of like one of my main worries is now, is that a lot of, obviously technology is growing exponentially fast. We're getting to the point where we, the next few years, maybe next 10 years, we'll start going beyond Moore's law with quantum computing and stuff like that. But the governments won't be able to slow these things down because the tech barons are pushing this stuff with money, and they're using things like religion and military prowess as excuses to justify pushing these things forward.
Yeah, let's look at a couple of those things. I think the first thing is the AI hype industry has given a really big boost to this stuff, and this idea of artificial general intelligence, or AGI, the idea that we're close to achieving that, and I'd say we're very, very far from achieving that. But the hype is out there. And the boosterism is out there. And again, in Kurzweil's books, he has this. But he writes this book called "The Singularity is Near: When Humans Transcend Biology." Comes out in 2005, and then he writes this sequel called "The Singularity is Nearer," which came out last year in June 2024. And we'll put the links
Sure.
out there as we always do. And he between that he wrote this book. He also wrote this book called he wrote this book called "The Age of Intelligent Machines: The Age of Spiritual Machines." And that's when he embraces this term called the singularity. And he's got this thing called the law of accelerating returns. And it's when you essentially get this exponential increase in technologies, and that's computers, genetics, nanotechnology, robotics, and artificial intelligence, and they all kind of converge. And then you get this kind of moment of singularity. And at that point, the machine intelligence and the humans merge. Right? And that's this 2045 date. Now, that moment is being kind of promoted, I think, by the artificial intelligence industry at the moment. I think a lot of it's hype. A lot of it, we are way, way from any of that. And the large language models, which are the things that are mainly being promoted, like they're nowhere near any kind of human consciousness. I don't think they ever will be by their very nature. And yeah, there's a lot of hype around that. And then you get... and let's go to Peter Thiel, and so Peter Thiel, we've mentioned him in different podcast episodes. Kind of Prince of Darkness, character of Silicon Valley. He's been behind many of the kind of seminal technology companies that we know and love the last 20 years. He's also been a figure behind kind of extreme right or right wing, new right politics. In the US, influential behind the Trump administration, J.D. Vance, all these people that we've been talking about. And his whole point, and this goes to your point, Simon, is that humanity or technology in a way has stagnated. So he's got this interesting view of things, which he says that technology stagnated sometime in the 70s. And we've been in this age of kind of relative stagnation. And all the things that have been invented, even the internet, they're kind of, they are technological advances, but they're not the really big fundamental advances in science that we should have been seeing. And his point is that society kind of in 1970 and society in 2025 are fundamentally the same. They're not that different. And he blames this stagnation actually on the hippies, funnily enough. So he kind of he's got this great phrase where he says, we landed on the moon, and then 3 months later we had the Woodstock Festival, and that's when everything kind of stopped.
Never trust the hippie type.
So
like that,
it's
yeah.
never trust the hippies, and the hippies kind of stop innovation in some way. And he says the world kind of goes into this thing of being too cautious, too careful, and environmentalism is also a big problem for him. So things like being concerned around global warming, those kind of things, that's a huge, big problem because it kind of holds back. So to go to his point then, so he's essentially saying we need to get rid of the controls on experimentation, which is really interesting that he's saying this. And as you said in the New York Times podcast, I definitely recommend it to people to go and watch it because it's a really interesting watch. He says, so you got transvestism, people dressing up as women. You got transsexualism of people, changing their sexual organs. But none of that's anything really. We should be able to change our heart, our brain. We should be able to change everything. So he essentially wants this kind of world of kind of no physical barriers.
Yeah.
On humanity. He's invested in lots of tech companies, but he's also invested in a lot of companies around things like biotechnology, embryo research. The ability to be able to kind of design your embryos, for your offspring, and those kind of things. It's really interesting because he's kind of spouting the Bible, which seems to be a relatively new thing for him, and then he's kind of saying that the Antichrist is essentially Greta Thunberg, the environmental activist, and saying that the environmentalists are kind of holding back progress in some way. And then he's also saying that kind of wokeness somehow is holding back technology somehow, although that's hard to see.
So, I mean, the wokeness is a bit hard to see. I can see what he's trying to do with the Greta Thunberg angle, just in terms of we've talked previously before about how much AI consumes in terms of data centers and things like that, and how it uses water and how it's damaging to the environment. So it's in his interest not to have her as somebody to go up against, because the more data centers he has that they can compute these things more, the faster he can get to his end game. So I'd imagine probably that's where he's sort of trying to sort of come from. And I think, again, that sort of theological aspect of trying to align things with sort of Christianity or Bible verses almost seems as a way of self-protectionism, So it feels like, oh, well, we can't be attacked because, we're Christians, or in the same way you say someone's anti-Semitic for doing something or Islamophobic for doing another. It gives them that kind of field of protection and makes it seem like their movement is justified. It almost makes it sound like they're trying to do, the work of, their God or whatever it is. But as you said, it all kind of ties into all these kind of scriptures, whether Christian, Hinduism, all these kind of things. There's all these kind of set things that they're kind of pulling from in order to kind of justify things that we wouldn't normally allow that level of progress to happen so quickly, because it's detrimental to humans as a race.
It's a risky one for him because the US Bible Belt. I agree. He's probably looking for some level of political protection by quoting the Bible, and it's become a bit of a trend, unfortunately, in US politics. All these people just spouting off Bible verses. Jordan Peterson does it as well. All these people just spouting off Bible verses. But it's a double-edged sword, right? Because the Bible Belt community in the US is against biological research, is against IVF, even against medical interventions in many cases, women's reproductive rights, definitely against homosexuality, and also pushes creationist beliefs and anti-science beliefs. I do think it's a double-edged sword for him, because that community is definitely not into transsexual experimentation and all this kind of stuff. For them, that's just weird. Yeah. So I definitely think it's a double-edged sword, and I think it's interesting that some of these people are way more likely to go out and just talk about things openly, and that's a result of the protection they feel in the current political climate. I mean, the Trump administration has just allowed people to let rip with stuff that they thought anyway, but they're just saying it more openly now. So, Peter Thiel probably wouldn't have gone on a New York Times podcast a few years ago, and he was kind of keeping away, especially from those kind of liberal media, as he would see it. Curtis Yarvin Also went out and did a New York Times podcast as well, someone we've talked about a lot on this podcast. And many of these people are just coming out with their beliefs in a much more kind of aggressive and open way. And it will be scary to a lot of people. It won't win them friends amongst many people when you actually see them. And in fact, the Peter Thiel podcast bits of it kind of went viral because it was so kind of out there. And I'm not sure that's the right tactic for them. It's very interesting. Sam Altman is almost the opposite. OpenAI, his whole thing is being very reassuring. This is going to be amazing for humanity. It's all going to be great. We're going to cure cancer. The AI is going to solve everything, right? Peter Thiel, it's way darker, and in fact, there's that bit in the podcast where they asked him, do you think humanity should survive? And he hesitates for like 2 minutes. He's not really sure, So it's definitely a risky thing for them, I would argue.
Well, there's this weird thing. There's this guy called Richard Sutton. I'll put his details down below. Who basically was, and he's one of the proponents in this sort of kind of industry as well. He talks a lot about AI and robots and stuff like that. And one of the things he said in a recent panel talk was that it would be racist if we don't allow the robots to exist, basically, or to move forward, right? And it then opens up the whole question of civil rights for AI and robots. But it comes back into this transhumanism. And with the integration of technology in a human, when does the human stop becoming a human, and when does it become a cyborg and a robot, and when does its rights then become different to the, So it's like they're already sort of trying to pave the way, from legal sort of kind of points of view in terms of, the way this is going. But it's quite a fascinating subject just in terms, I think the hype machine, I think you're definitely right in that in terms of AI. I think there's a lot of that trying to sort of kind of raise capital. But I think also on the flip side of it, I think we're probably about 5 years behind the veil of what they're letting the public see. Because to my mind, as I mentioned before, it doesn't really seem like there's anything artificial about artificial intelligence and nothing intelligent about artificial intelligence either, unless these guys are specifically talking about other things which we've seen, being used in the military, which we'll talk about in another episode, and we can see how that's being used in the Ukraine, how we can see it's being used in Palestine, Israel, all that kind of stuff, to that kind of greater effect. And that's probably where that bleeding edge stuff is really being used, and that probably is in itself artificial intelligence. And maybe that's the kind of area that we need to worry about more, which we'll get onto later. But
it's funny you should say that, because part of this, I would argue the kind of golden age for these people is around sort of 2015, because at that point transhumanism still is presented as a kind of positive thing, and it's mainly kind of more sort of boosterism, right? There's going to be this kind of exciting thing, although there's always kind of the dark theorists behind it as well, people like Nick Land that we've talked about before, and people like that. But generally speaking, a lot of science, there's science fiction writers, there's people like the people who form the actual official, transhumanist movement. They also form political parties in many countries, like transhumanist parties, and they say they're like beyond left and right. They call themselves like up wing rather than left wing or right wing, because they kind of want to uplift humanity as a whole. So the whole thing is still relatively kind of presented in positive terms back then. So that's their kind of golden moment. And back then, and to go to your point, they create this thing called the Transhumanist Bill of Rights. And it's got like some important writers. It's a crowdsourced document, but it's like published in like Wired magazine. They've got like Bruce Sterling, the science fiction writer. There's a lot of people involved in this thing, and it's quite intimate, because it does do a little bit of what you said of how do you redefine what human rights are. So the Transhumanist Bill of Rights focuses on protecting the rights of human beings, genetically modified human beings, cyborgs, digital intelligences, intellectually enhanced, previously non-sapient animals, any species of plant or animal which has been enhanced to possess the capacity for intelligent thought, and other advanced sapient life forms. Wow. So it broadens the definition.
It's fully inclusive,
transhumanist, Bill of Rights that in fact opens rights to a whole bunch of new intelligences, including animals, if you can enhance their.
So this is up until so 2050 is their kind of golden.
No, 2015 is
when
they published this,
okay.
and I think it's their golden age, because they're getting a lot of positive media. It feels like a good thing still, and it feels like it can be a positive thing, and you're kind of opening things up to other species and potential forms of sapient life and so on, right? And they essentially go with this Bill of Rights. They publish it in Wired magazine. It's like an open source kind of thing. And then there's this guy called Zoltan Istvan, and he does this kind of Martin Luther moment, and he goes up to the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court, and he tries to kind of post the Transhumanist Bill of Rights kind of on the wall or something, and then he gets kind of surrounded by the Capitol Police, and you kind of say, don't you dare post this thing, and then he eventually does post it to like the north side wall of the U.S. Capitol. It's documented in this documentary film called Immortality or Bust.
Okay.
And then they do this version 2 that's in Wired magazine as a version 3 and so on. This guy Isfan also goes to the World Economic Forum and gets received by the hallowed ranks of the CEOs in Davos and talks about this transhumanist Bill of Rights. So it feels like they kind of have this moment, and it doesn't seem as dark or as necessarily dark and negative as it feels now. Partly, I think, also because there's all these debates going on within the transhumanist movement between kind of more left-wing, more right-wing, kind of more liberal, more conservative factions, and I think at that point they're very concerned to make this kind of quite inclusive. And there's a lot of talk about digital rights, about the kind of implications for humanity, the social implications, and so on. So it feels like a more of an open discussion, and that's definitely, I think, compared to the discussions now. I mean, the discussions now seem kind of unhinged in some way, but also kind of very extreme. So, I mean, we talked before about Mark Andreessen. He's gone from someone who seemed relatively open to somebody who comes across now as quite unhinged. And again, with this kind of idea that you just have to kind of unleash this technology. Anybody who questions it is kind of holding people back. And in fact, he's kind of, evil in some way. And, he's got this techno-optimist manifesto, and it's called Optimist, but then it's kind of the inspiration for it is Marinetti and the Italian futurists and kind of fascism, essentially. Yeah. So it does feel like it's taken a darker turn. They're less willing to have a kind of actual open discussion with democratic society about what this means for us all. And they're just kind of pushing this kind of brutalist idea that technology is just going to win anyway, and we better just go with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite. So I was just connecting some, well, maybe not even connecting, but thinking about connecting a couple of dots together from sort of like one of the previous episodes we mentioned, and some people who are at like the forefront of developing AI, like Mo Gadwat, who's I think the chief technological AI officer for Google back in the day, and they were talking about kind of like the real apocalyptic or dystopian sort of era we may be facing if we don't control AI. And one of the solutions that they keep coming up with is this idea of the only way to control AI is to give AI a god. So you have an AI god, which we develop. I'm just linking that back to the transhumanism now in terms of like how they're trying to integrate themselves into technology. They see themselves as these kind of mythical gods. Are they trying to become the gods of the AI that they're sort of referring to now, because they'll be part human, part tech? Are they kind of in their own minds thinking that they'll be able to control the way AI is and all this kind of stuff? Is there a kind of connection there, would you think?
Yeah, I do, yeah. And I think we've talked about it a little bit in previous episodes. I mean, at no point in history has there been a situation like this where such a small group of people has amassed such incredible wealth and power.
And they're all unhinged as well.
Well, is it the
Mostly.
wealth? Is it the wealth that's making them unhinged? Is it exaggerating certain characteristics that they already had? I mean, all of them were more reasonable, ostensibly at least 5 years ago, and all of them seem to have been unleashed now by the climate around the Trump victory. Right?
To a degree, I mean, we know that some of them are on various spectrums, which allows them to be able to do what they do precisely and effectively. We've even seen, but we've also seen that with, it's going to be a weird tangent, but we've also seen that with kinds of like hip hop stars, like Kanye West, who's had a mass of money. We know he's bipolar and got some very weird views from Hitler to whatever it may be. He's got a song N-word Hitler and all this kind of stuff. But the reason why I think these things then blow out of proportion is because the media allow these people to have a platform as well in the first place. And there aren't enough opposing views, because where we are with, especially with like legacy news media, they're having to keep up with social media and the sensationalism. So, that's why, the media love Trump so much, because it's a new headline every single kind of day. So with these guys now, they're almost kind of an extension of that. Let them have their platforms. Let them make us feel like, there's some sort of progression going forward. And like you say, the way they almost describe it is like we're all in this game together. We're all going down this route together, where it's not. It's just a small group, a small elite of people. The same way Elon wants to, go and colonize Mars. And there was an interesting thing the other day where somebody was trying to make a connection of all Elon's companies. And they said that it's got nothing to do with Earth whatsoever. And they were basically saying the boring company isn't for like cars to go under the streets of LA. It was basically saying, well, there's no real atmosphere in Mars, so you would have to do everything through tunnels. The whole idea of the Tesla robots, where you need a workforce up there to work and build infrastructure, and they pinned in the Neuralink to that and all these kind of things, which was quite interesting, because obviously they're thinking out of different boxes and different remits, these kind of tech barons. But if they're given that freedom to move, like we've talked, in terms of like being able to bypass the FDA, or like you say, make these things seem positive and all inclusive, people will be going for it. Because in this era of sort of wokeism, nobody wants to be as confrontational. As we talked about in previous episodes as well, with the kind of like the rise of the alt-right and all that kind of stuff. All these things have got an element of pushing these things forward. But it's also like when you're talking about sort of the Peter Thiel and sort of like the Christian sort of side of things, or the evangelical side that comes in, where his standpoint doesn't quite match up with that. I wonder if there's other puppeteers behind this, because I mean these guys have got their own wealth and their own money and their own investment, but are they having to take on some of these political or religious narratives to be able to fast track this stuff through, so they're not, because obviously they don't necessarily have their kind of seasteading things sort of set up already kind of yet. Are they doing that because they have to remain within the confines of those kind of governments?
But I mean, there's a lot there, right? I mean, first of all, I mean we're in an era where U.S. politics is unhinged, and the second victory of Trump was the victory of what I call the unhinging of America, and we should look at this in a separate episode. I mean, the narrative, the public narrative, public discourse is completely unhinged, and Trump represents that unhinging of America in a very self-conscious way, of just kind of putting stuff out there that he knows doesn't make sense. The kind of crazy theatrics, the kind of the wrestling aesthetics that people have kind of identified as his main aesthetics is around kind of world wrestling. What's called WWE and those kind of stuff, right? And it's and that is a kind of unhinging. The cosplay that we talked about in other episodes, the dark cosplay, is a kind of unhinging. And the tech billionaires, who, as you said, are kind of borderline personality types, in some ways, many of them, they've really kind of thrived in a way in that kind of unhinged environment, because it allows them to come out with their kind of prejudices, but also their kind of dreams as well. And someone like Elon Musk, like you said, he's an amazing dreamer, and he's also somebody who is really good at telling stories. And getting people to buy into his stories. I mean, look at Tesla. I mean, it's he took an idea, someone else's idea, but he created this incredible story about it, around it being kind of transformative for the world economy, and that has proved really really resilient in a way. I mean, the company, not great, but it's almost like there's a cult around it. Where the share price can still keep going up because people have bought into this narrative, and like you said, he's now. He's sold the idea of Mars a long time ago, and in a way you can kind of interpret everything he's doing around having, he said there's going to be 1 billion robots in the US in the next 10 years. So all this is partly salesmanship and partly hype to raise more and more capital, but it translates into real power as well. And you can see the valuations around AI, around data, the people creating data centers, just these crazy valuations, right? And that gives you power, right, as well. So they're able to thrive in this environment, right? And the environment is one where they can push and say, just don't hold us back. We don't need any control. And Peter Thiel's whole thing, and when he talks in the podcast about his conversations with Elon Musk, is like, does Elon really want to go to Mars? Are we really going to be able to do it, or does he realize now that he can't go to Mars? And it's kind of like we need to push through all the barriers, the political barriers, to go to this something else. That's also how they sell their companies and get these valuations, right? But there's something to it, right? There's something to a situation, an economic, political situation where these kind of ultra powerful, unhinged individuals are kind of given free reign. And again, I don't think we've seen anything like that since the 1920s, where you had these kind of robber barons in the US, your Rockefellers and people like that, and the Standard Oil and the railway trusts, and you had these individuals who were just so incredibly wealthy. It's the Gatsby age, right?
Yeah.
But also massive undercurrent of decadentism as well. And I think one of the things, just to finish, I mean, at this point is there's also a really decadent stream in all this as well, of kind of slightly crazy, lack of empathy. If you pick a lot of it apart, a lot of it doesn't make sense for people. And ultimately, are they selling the vision of a better world? Because I think in the 90s and noughties, they were still able to present that picture. But these days, it doesn't really look like a better world. It's a different world, but it doesn't look better.
I also wonder, just to plant a conspiracy, whether, when I was talking about sort of like Peter Thiel and this idea of whether somebody else is kind of playing a narrative into that as well, where there is a lot of psyops involved into this from a political standpoint, in terms of the way we see the fighting of the superpowers, of like, we know the strength of China as a superpower, we know the strength of it as an economic power, and while they're worrying about them developing $500 drones because that seems next level, but we're over here in the West creating the next human, the next species. We're not worrying about that. We're going to be far superior anyway. And I wonder if there's a narrative trying to be played out there as well, because we've seen that a lot with everything from these recent things in Congress with like the kind of UFO type things and all this kind of stuff, and people believing that these little grey men are kind of exoskeletons, and they've got no gender specification to them, so maybe they are the transhuman versions of us from the future. All these kind of psyop things to play in what is a very volatile sort of Trumpist world at the moment. I'm wondering if they're just trying to leverage all these different types of kind of angles to, inadvertently maybe, scare off the Chinese or, stuff like that,
I definitely think there's some state level trolling going on in all of this, and particularly around AI. And we can maybe look at this, I think, also in the episode we'll do around the kind of technological military complex. So there's definitely that level, but I also think there's a huge level just of distraction and of spectacle for the US population itself. I mean, the US population is hypnotized, and the US has got this kind of ability, I think, because of people's relative kind of disorganization and atomization, that you can just kind of hypnotize people with spectacle, whether that's kind of the celebrity, the cult of the celebrity, the theatre, the bread and circuses. And now, this idea that somehow there's this kind of California future of kind of transcendence through the AI, through the kind of merging of the AI, I think is a powerful, essentially religious idea. I mean, going back to what we talked about at the beginning. The reality of it is that Americans are more, American society is more disequal than ever. Poorer people, live far worse than they've done in the past. Life is more stressful. People are relatively earning less, and so on, right? And you've got these kind of extreme instances of inequality. I mean, I read somewhere that recently that 400 people own the equivalent of wealth of the entire black population of the US is 400 people. Of 400 rich people own the same as all the black people in the US, and you get these kind of extremes, and then Americans also are unhealthy, right? So there's there's this whole trend of kind of obesity, mental health problems. That's partly RFK, coming into the government, is concerned with those kind of issues. But and they've had the opioid crisis and all these kind of things. And that, for me, what they're offering here is this kind of continual dream of some kind of technological transcendence, whereas in the meantime, the kind of existence that you have between the very rich and the very poor, and the experience you have of life, is completely different, and it's getting more different,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, there's lots of people complaining about all these wars that the US are fighting, and they're not dealing with the like kind of opioid sort of crisis that they have there, or the other kind of issues of obesity and stuff they have there. And it may be interesting just to kind of throw a map up on the screen now, just in terms of like the US population is what, about 330, 340 million, something around that kind of mark. And we talked previously before about, you know, echo chambers or echo bubbles, these kind of little bubbles of things which get spread out on social media. And if we look at like the small little pinpoint of Silicon Valley on the greater map of like the US, you know, and how much noise is being made from that, it's not going to solve the problems of, you know, the greater masses, you know. And it's like this idea of this decadence again that you're talking about. You know, Silicon Valley is a very kind of a contrasting sort of area, you know, with like homeless people living on the streets right next to these multi-billion-pound sort of kind of companies. It's becoming more and more interesting how they rationalise it, and this idea that you're saying where they rationalise it with things like theatre and justifying it like that is quite key. And we talked about that previously with, like, you know, putting the jester or the clown in the courts room, sort of making these noises, you know.
But you remember we also talked about on the previous episode on the assault on reality, we talked about, you know, this idea that they know in a way that people's experience is not going to be that great for large part of the population. So what do? You plug people into the VR, you plug people into some version of the metaverse, and then you're sitting around, you know, wearing your virtual Gucci shirt with some attractive AI boyfriend or girlfriend, right? And that's a substitute for reality, which is physical reality, which is, you know, hot, boring, mundane, hardworking.
And it's one of those things where, you know, all these VR sets, and it's a kind of low level form of transhumanism, and in terms of taking to another place, and it's quite interesting because it'll take us on to the next episode. So one of the guys we want to talk about the next one, Palmer Luckey, or is it Lucky Palmer, who invented the Oculus Rift, which is now owned by Meta, did all the VR stuff, and has now categorically moved into artificial intelligence for the military. Gives us a lovely segue to the next episode, I think. So I think on that, Ben, there's definitely areas that we should come back to this episode again, because there's such a deep rabbit hole, and we'll put all the kind of links below as well to sort of, like, you know, the research of the books, or sort of any kind of podcast that we're kind of listening to. But I think it's definitely something that we should probably try and revisit, you know, at least on a quarterly basis, you know, or for as long as this series lasts.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is not over yet, and in a way, this is you can see this in a way as the official religion of these tech barons of Silicon Valley in its modern form, right? Which is not the Silicon Valley of 10 or 20 years ago. So I think it's really interesting to kind of keep looking at this as a kind of barometer of, you know, what 100%. These people really think they're going to do and where things are going.
And to see how fast this progress actually is, we can get a kind of feel of what the exponential growth is in terms of where they're kind of taking this. So thanks very much, Ben, and I'll see you next on The Plan again soon.
Thanks.